All right, so let me just start off by saying what we are probably thinking about this parable. Yuck. Yuck. The master in this parable is really harsh and punitive on the servant who was given the 1 talent, especially when we look at that he really did not commit any crime. The master got back all his money. Nothing was lost. The only thing that he did that seemed to upset the master was his lack of action. Every single penny, by the way, we're talking about a lot of money here. When you look at talents, it's interesting. If you go read, I don't know if you have, this is from the new RSV, and it uses the word talents, but you look at the NIV and some other, and it'll talk about denarii or talk about money. So we're really talking about like a boatload of money. A talent was worth about 15 years worth of wages. By our standards, if our standard now is a wage of $7.25 per hour, the value of the talent would approximately be about $225,000, maybe a little bit more than that. If we look at the median year average wage, which in 2018 was around $33,000, then a talent would be well over $500,000. The servant who had 5 talents, that had a boatload of money. So this is a lot of money that these servants, these slaves, were given to invest or do with to keep while the master was gone. So when the servant gives back the talent, just as when he received it, and nothing else is given, the master is outraged. The servant tries to defend his action or lack by telling the master that he was fearful because he knew the master was a harsh man, reaping where he did not sow and gathering where he did not scatter wheat. So he buried the talent in the ground so it would be safe. And just so you know, back in those days, that's what was done. That's where people kept their money, their prized possessions. They would bury it. So that was a practice that was known. The furious master takes the money that was entrusted to the servant, gives it to the first. But then this is when it really gets harsh. So not only is he yelled at, not only is his money taken away, then the master says to him, "You worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." This parable does not fit in neatly with our picture of a loving and gracious God who pours blessings in abundance upon his people. A God that we are told that is slow to anger and quick to forgive. Where is the grace in this, we cry out? Where is the mercy, we want to know? It's not fair or right or just. Yeah, maybe the guy could have done a little bit more, but the master got back his money. Nothing was taken, nothing was lost. So what is it that we're missing here? What is it if we're barking up the wrong tree, focusing on the wrong thing? What if this parable is really not about the money or the talent? I think we have to understand where the parable is. It's at the end of Matthew. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem and ultimately the cross. We know that Jesus is concerned with his disciples and their ability to carry on when he is no longer there with them in the flesh. He wants to prepare them to be able to handle the obstacles, the hurdles, the attacks. He wants them to stay strong in the face of adversity. Seen in that light, could it be that Jesus was really concerned about what the disciples will do with the faith that they're given? That Jesus was really more concerned about how that they would witness to kingdom living, how they would spread the good news? This is kind of the way that I went with this parable. It kind of makes more sense to me. Jesus telling that, preparing them for the days ahead when their faith would be tested time and time again as they waited for his return. A return that we remember that they anticipated would happen sooner than later, but certainly in their lifetime. I think this way of interpretation invites us to look at this parable not out of fear, but rather as an invitation to participate in the adventure of discipleship. To be light bearers, truth tellers, disciples who take on Jesus' banner, spreading the good news in words and in actions. Jill Dufield writes this: perhaps the talents in this tale represent wisdom. Here's that wisdom thing again. Seeing and understanding the presence and the will of Jesus. Those who recognize the Messiah and follow and learn more about who God is and what God requires. Those who perceive rightly the character of God, acting accordingly, and in turn gain more wisdom. It is in the practice of faith that our faith deepens and grows in turn. When we fail to exercise it, it diminishes. A life of faith requires taking risks for the sake of the gospel, demands of us enough trust to let go of our talents, our gifts, our resources, to be used in service to the God who can entrust us with them. It is our letting go that we find freedom and expand our faith. You know that old saying, you have to lose your life in order to gain it. It's this contrary thing that we see. It's in the letting go that we actually gain our freedom. And then she goes on to write in her little piece this. She says, can we trust the God who lifts up prophets and provides in the wilderness? The God who sends the Son not to condemn the world but to save it? To use the talents given us in ways that demonstrate the abundant love of God? Might we begin by taking small risks for Christ's sake, right where we are with what we have, being faithful in little as we experience God's goodness and become even more faithful in much. So that got me thinking. COVID-19 has certainly changed the way that we do things. It changes the way that we go to the grocery store. It changes the way that we gather. It's going to change Thanksgiving and Christmas for many of us. And it has changed the way that we do church and worship. Some of the changes that have happened over these last 6, 7, 8 months aren't going to go away once we get back to what we will call a more normal way of living. So within that in mind, I went and was kind of looking up some articles, and I came across the Barna group. You know, the Barna, they do a lot of research. And this is a new one that they've done since the COVID-19 has struck. And they had a guest columnist by Carrie Newwolf, I hope I pronounced that right, on generational preferences for in-person worship. Because we've heard all sorts of things about what's going to happen once we can come back together and start to sing and get close to one another and perhaps even have a coffee hour. So it says, so how many people are coming back to in-person gathering when COVID is over? That's the question that he was tackling. And the answer based on the research is apparently fewer than we think and fewer than we hope for. According to the study, 6 questions about the future of hybrid church experience, only 41% of Gen X, and let me explain to you who don't know who the Gen Xers are, they are those who between the ages of, it depends on what you look on site, you look on between 7 and 8 and 22 and 23. So let me tell you, those who've been coming to church, only 41% of those are going to continue to come when COVID is over. They want to return primarily and stay where they are. 42% of millennials, so let's go back to it, 42% of millennials who have been attending church, once COVID is over, only 42 are coming back. Now your millennials are the big group that we hear about. They're the 22, 23 through the about 38. They prefer primary, only about the 42% prefer primary worship, which means, of course, that the majority aren't. So, looking at this, it's easy to say, well, this is just an unprecedented year. Things will get back to normal soon. But that's not going to be what happens. The church is still going to be around. And we've seen this coming. I think what COVID has just done has sped it up. The church is still going to be here. It's just leaving the building. It's just leaving the building. In-person worship isn't going away, and we are not going to stop in-person worship, and I imagine most churches are. But it likely won't play the role it used to, even as recently as a year ago. Our presbytery is even taking steps now in helping churches that don't have funds to make sure that they can do live streaming. He goes on to say this, and I thought this was really interesting. If your mission is to fill buildings, then keep going with your current strategy. So if our mission is to fill this building, but if your mission is to reach people, it may be time to rethink things. So I hope that you've kind of been hearing this from us and the leadership a little bit over the last several years when you talk about, I keep trying to say to you that you can't gauge just what you see on a Sunday morning. I mean, Allison had 19 to 21 kids in Joy Company, and Kylie the other day had 18 kids at youth group. And there are people here on the campus that go in and out. There's all sorts of ways to measure how we are reaching out, spreading the good news. So before we get our backs up or discouraged or worse, bury our heads in the sand and just ignore the issues facing the church, hoping that it's going to go right back to the way it was, how we've always known it, how we grew up, I want us to pose the same question that was posed in the parable, but in light of the Barna study. And that what I mean is, in view of the information found in this study, are we going to react with fear and get our backs up and be resistant? Or are we going to see this as an opportunity, an invitation to participate in the venture of faithful discipleship? When you look at the talents as being used to spread the good news, go back and let us look at how the master began at the beginning of this parable. The servant said, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. That's how he saw the master. But he did not take into account how much that master gave him to hold on to and be responsible for. He entrusted those servants with all of his wealth. And he wanted them, he says it, he wanted them to enter into the joy with him. But the one who received the one's fear kept him from even putting it into a savings account. And listen, I looked up the interest rates. They're not that great. They're like 0.1%. And I think it said if you invest something like $1,000, you might get $10. Is that about right? That's about 1% in it. I mean, so what we're asking here, so taking that into context, the master wasn't expecting this miraculous miracles, but the master was expecting once again, I'm going to use some of the stuff that we've used in the egram this last week. He didn't want the servant to be lukewarm. Do something, anything. God is rooting for us. God has given us gifts. God expects us to use what we have. So the question becomes is, how will we respond? How will we respond? Because I have to tell you, I mean, we've been seeing it coming down the road. Church is changing. Church is changing. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, even though we might lament the way it used to be. But with change, there's also good, and there's new joys to anticipate. So do we do nothing out of fear, dig in our heels, out of lack of vision or willingness to change, or will we see this as an invitation? Will we start inviting some of the younger voices to the table? We need to hear those voices. You know, it was a good thing having Forrest on session. We need to hear from the young people. We need to hear from Lindsay. We need to hear from Forrest. We need to hear from Sarah and Audrey. We need to hear from Robin and RJ. We need to hear these voices so that we can make good decisions and so we can see what we can do with our talent, even if it only gets 0.1%. It's kind of amazing. God works in crazy ways. But last year, Allison and Debbie went to ABSE, and ABSE is the Association for Presbyterian Christian Educators. Last year in 2019, their topic was, well, actually it really happened at the very beginning of 220, around February. Their topic was out of the box. Out of the box. What are we going to do different? Getting out of the box. Allison this year with Joy Company, that's her topic with Joy Company, moving them out of the box. So maybe it's time for us to think out of the box. Out of the box. How can we spread the good news? It's not, okay, I'm going to say, it's not about packing it so we feel good about what we've done, packing it in here. It's about going out and serving the needs, spreading the good news, showing people how to love and care, respect and honor one another. It's about being light bearers, bringing hope and justice. It's about taking a stand. It's about doing a helping hand. It's about kingdom living. Kingdom living happens in here, and it happens out there. What are we going to do? How will we respond? That's the question. And we will see, won't we? We will see.